All right, folks, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this week's edition of the Sunday Wire. I'm your host, Patrick Henningsen. We're streaming out live on the Alternate Current Radio Network. I want to welcome onto the stage right now a very special guest. He is a scholar in international relations and global affairs, a great geopolitical analyst, and a great voice for insight and reason, especially in the current crisis that we have right now in the Middle East. Joining us from the Islamic Republic of Iran, Dr. Mohammad Marandi from the University of Tehran. Dr. Marandi, thank you for joining us this week on the Sunday Wire.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So there's a lot to cover. I know that we spoke about possibly doing a segment last week, and I thought, wow, everything that happened in the previous 7 days was enough to talk about. Another 7 days has passed, Dr. Marandi, and more has unfolded that has made the picture even more compelling and more complex. I just want to give you the floor just to get your kind of synopsis of where the situation is right now in the Middle East. And we can talk about the Iranian perspective, because I think this is a crucial perspective, and also the Yemeni perspective as well. And the theme that I have here, Dr. Marandi, is the emergence of a new Middle East. This is what we see happening. You and I and many others who've been paying attention to the region closely for a long time, knowing what to look for, know that this process of the emergence of a new Middle East has been developing for quite some time. But now things are accelerating at a pace that I, quite frankly, did not expect to see so quickly. But here we are. Go ahead, Dr. Marandi.
Yes, things are changing very rapidly. And this is for a host of reasons. The war in Ukraine, which continues as we speak, has served as a catalyst. And now the war in Gaza alongside that, or the genocide in Gaza alongside that, has pushed things even further. And the changes are happening more rapidly. There's talk, serious talk, that the Israelis plan now to invade Lebanon and to carry out a major air assault across the country. We don't know if that's their real intention or if they're simply trying to gain some sort of concessions through the threat of a major strike, but it does seem to be quite plausible. And then, as you and I both know, we have the escalation with the Americans involved, both in the Red Sea, but also in Iraq and Syria. And we've just received news that a number of American soldiers, at least 3, have been killed in Syria, although the Americans have said Jordan, but my understanding is that they were killed inside Syria, but we'll have to wait for confirmation on that. I think the Americans probably wanted to say Jordan because their presence in Syria is illegal. They don't have the right to have soldiers in Syria. And so if they're killed in Syria, any response would be illegitimate. But so it's convenient to say Jordan, but the Jordanians have said that the strike didn't take place on our side of the border. But in any case, we see escalation in Syria and therefore in Iraq as well, because the resistance in Syria is linked to the resistance in Iraq. So it is a big mess. It's very dangerous. And in war, things happen that are not expected that can lead to even further escalation. So we don't know what will happen in the coming days, what the Americans are going to do, what the Israelis are going to do. But I think it's pretty safe to say that it's going to get worse.
And also, we saw the 2 Navy SEALs were reportedly, I don't know, they said a boating accident or lost at sea in the Gulf of Aden or in this area around the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, clearly involved in some kind of operation relating to Yemen. we see this time and time again, American soldiers who aren't supposed to be somewhere, not going to be announced. So it's suffice to say, Dr. Marandi, that America is deeply involved, too deeply involved, perhaps, unable to manage how far they've been spread thin across the region in some of the most precarious positions in Iraq, in Syria, and elsewhere. And so this is what people are saying right now. There's American proponents are saying, who would dare challenge American dominance, overwhelming military dominance in the region? Who would dare do such a thing? But people have already challenged that, and the U.S. has not responded. And I'm seeing more of the same. What's your kind of assessment of this?
Yes, the more the U.S. responds, the more heavy the retaliation, because the people in the region want the Americans out. They're not going to accept this. Just like in Gaza, Gazans are going to resist the genocide. They're going to resist the Israeli troops that are coming in to massacre people. And in Syria and Iraq, people are saying enough is enough. The problem with the United States is that it still thinks that this is the 1990s, where it was the hyperpower or the last remaining superpower, and we had reached the end of history, as Fukuyama once said. Even though Fukuyama himself later on changed his position, but that is still the mentality, that the United States is the indispensable nation, that it stands taller and looks farther, as Madeleine Albright claimed. And that sense of supremacism creates an unwarranted arrogance that leads to the catastrophic situation that we're seeing, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's in West Asia, whether it's in dealing with China. The United States is overstretched. It simply cannot manage. It has multiple crises at home, the border crisis, the crisis of identity that we now see, the hatred between the different camps in the United States. There's so many things that are going on, and it's bound to get worse for the United States. So let's take, I don't want to speak about Gaza for the moment, because I think we all know what's going on in Gaza. And I'm pretty sure your viewers are politically aware, so I'll try to be brief. But in the case of the Red Sea, the United States has created this crisis. Yemen simply said, Ansarullah, or what the Americans in the West like to call the Houthis, Ansarullah, they simply said, we're going to establish a blockade on an Israeli port or Israeli ports. And that's it. And we have no problem with 99%, over 99% of the shipping that goes through the Red Sea. And that blockade has to do with the genocide. The genocide has to stop for the blockade to stop. Very simple. The Americans and their sidekick, the British, they came in, they killed Yemeni sailors, even though the sailors had killed no one. They had destroyed no ship. They only hit ships with light missiles so that they wouldn't be severely damaged and so that no one would be killed. Only the ships that refused to obey. So they struck a few ships, created slight damage, so they turned away. And then the Americans started killing Yemeni sailors and Yemeni soldiers. And so Yemen then decided that, okay, from now on, American ships and British ships will also be targeted. So the Americans have created a crisis in the Red Sea that was unnecessary. Why? Because they're arrogant. Because they think that, again, like Madeleine Albright, this American exceptionalism, this sense of supremacism, as she said, we stand taller, we look farther, we're indispensable. That mentality creates an arrogance where they come to the conclusion that all we have to do is roar and everyone is going to flee. Well, that's not going to happen anymore. It's not happening in Gaza. It's not happening in Yemen, in the Red Sea, in Iraq, or Syria. So what is the American government going to do now? Are they going to do the smart thing and de-escalate and try to create better relations with the people of the region? No. They're going to continue escalate with escalation and only make things worse for everyone, but more important for at least the American people, for themselves.
So the simple solution would have been, Mohammed, in the past, to get your diplomatic corps mobilized, meet with the Israeli delegation and say, can we put a pause to this? Can we hit the brakes here? This is going out of control. So this policy of no diplomacy, am I wrong to say this is the US-UK de facto position? We've seen it with Ukraine. We're seeing it here. No diplomacy. It seems like there's a new kind of way of doing international politics, which is only based on objectives or only based on power alliances, like great power politics here. No more diplomacy, no more meeting in the middle. And I don't think the Americans are taking the political ramifications of all of this into consideration, the long term. I really don't think they realize that those are serious political ramifications worldwide going into the future. I honestly believe that this has not been thought out. And I don't know if I'm being, a little bit hyperbolic there, but it doesn't seem like people are thinking this through. Is it a case of that, or is there something else at play, Dr. Marandi?
I'm sure what you're saying is absolutely correct. I also think that the United States doesn't know how to do diplomacy, that at least since the end of the Cold War, they've stopped doing that sort of thing. Their expectation is that the world simply obeys the United States. If there are agreements, everyone else has to abide by those agreements, and the Americans will decide whether they abide by their commitments or not. They are above the law. They are superior. That doesn't work anymore. And the reason why it doesn't work anymore is actually because that's been their behavior for a long time, and people are sick and tired of it. And as the United States declines, people want to get rid of the United States from their country, from their region. So the Americans have created over the last few decades a lot of contempt and hatred across the globe. And as the United States declines, it's beginning to show. But in any case, under these much more difficult circumstances, the United States should know how to do diplomacy, or should be able to carry out diplomacy better than before. But it's the exact opposite. The Americans know nothing about diplomacy or the art of diplomacy, and that only makes things more complicated. I also think that this war is an American war. The Americans are fully behind the Israelis. This is not an Israeli war. The real force behind this whole genocide is Washington. The United States has been opposed to a ceasefire from the beginning. The United States has been repeating the false propaganda of the Israeli regime since day one. And the United States has been sending in weapons and ammunition and supplies and financial support so that the Israeli regime could sustain the war. Otherwise, the war would have been over a long time ago. We've seen that the Israeli regime is very weak. It's very vulnerable. It hasn't been able to defeat Hamas. And so how is it going to defeat Hezbollah, which is much stronger than Hamas? How is it going to ever even think about conflict with Yemen or Iraq or Syria, let alone Iran? here, Israel has been exposed to be a weak and vulnerable regime with which has not been able to show itself to be strong in intelligence gathering. It's shown itself to be incompetent militarily. Killing ordinary people and carrying out a genocide is not military competence. In fact, I think the greatest defeat for the Israeli regime is the fact that it's carrying out this genocide. But in any case, this is an American war. Without the Americans, it wouldn't happen. And what the Americans have done is that they've destroyed U.S. soft power. For decades to come, the Americans will never be able to criticize Russia or Russian human rights or China and Chinese human rights. The world will laugh. They'll say, you carried out this genocide in front of our eyes. So the United States is declining militarily. It is declining economically through these endless wars. It has declined politically, and its soft power has more than declined. It's been destroyed.
I would say the same, even worse for Israel, for the Israeli brand. Its mythology, its national story, that's the source of. It's gone. It's victim status. So and let's talk about that for a moment, because when you have these debates, and we hear a lot of these debates, Dr. Marandi, people are hyper focused on the military prowess of different countries and how they're ranking, how they're doing. The soft power, the legal judicial side, the human rights side, all of these things matter in their totality. But how significant is this for Israel going forward? Because it hasn't been around, or the entity has only been going for 75 years, and it's really built on that kind of idea that these are victims and they must get extra special protection because of what happened in World War II with the Holocaust and so forth. I mean, that to me is the source of Israeli power beyond anything, and its legitimacy, if you will, among parts of the international community. But that's been eviscerated. Can that brand ever be repaired?
No, I personally don't think that Israel will survive in the long run. I don't think it's going to last for many more years because its brand has been totally demolished. I recall in the early days when I spoke with you, I asked you about the mood inside the United States, and you were skeptical about any shift towards, or at least you hadn't seen any shift at that time during the early days in public opinion in the United States. And then later on, I think when I again asked you a few weeks later, you said there's been a sizable shift in the United States. When the attitude among many people, I'm not saying the majority, but many people in the United States changes towards Israel. Imagine what it's like in the rest of the world. In China, people now despise Israel.
Wow.
My Chinese colleagues and my Chinese friends that I'm in constant communication with, I travel to China regularly, they say that before the war, it was 50-50. Now people hate Israel. They despise Israel. Or in Russia, the mood has changed as well. Across the global south, maybe India to a degree is an exception to the rule, though there are two sides in India. But across the globe, Israel is now despised. Even in Europe, public opinion is much more negative towards Israel, as far as I can understand, compared to the mood in the United States. So Israel has demolished its image. And Israel has also demolished its image as a rational or democratic or humane society. That's gone. It's seen as a genocidal regime. But also, militarily, no one takes it seriously anymore. It's been 3.5 months now, and they've achieved nothing in Gaza. Hamas today, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and their allies, today They are stronger than they were 3.5 months ago. They're getting new recruits. They're learning from their experiences on the battlefield. They're building new tunnels. Israel has been defeated by a group, not by a country, by a group surrounded in a small enclave, in a small surrounded city, which the Israelis have full control over. The Israelis supposedly are their intelligence gathering is, they would always say, is second to none. They didn't know about these capabilities. They didn't know about the attack, that an attack was about to take place. And for the last 3.5 months, have been unable to defeat Hamas underground. Do you remember during the first days they were going to use seawater to flood all the tunnels? What happened? They haven't been able to do anything. So their intelligence gathering, the myth about their intelligence capabilities, demolished. The myth about their military capabilities is demolished. And the myth about it being a democratic and humane society and a victim is completely demolished. Many of the more educated people in Israel will leave. Those who have 2 passports and can get better jobs in the West, they'll leave because Israel is no longer safe. No sane person is going to invest in Israel in the future. So you're going to have further decline in the months and years ahead. And as I said, I don't think that Israel is going to last very long.
So based on all that, what you're saying there, if it's a case of the regime surviving, be it the Netanyahu regime, the Gantz regime, or whatever form it takes in the public face, but the Zionist regime based in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem or wherever they claim to have their capital, they need to draw the United States in to survive into a wider conflict. That seems to be, a lot of people are looking at this as this is where the rhetoric is heading, by the way, in the United States, is towards Iran. And is this, how do you think the United States is going to be pulled into this, or do you think that saner heads might prevail? Because certainly, Dr. Marandi, the U.S. has war-gamed out what a confrontation with Iran would look like, at least theoretically. It can't be positive for the United States. I just can't see any benefit. They'd have to evacuate the entire region, basically, and maybe never come back. What do you think about this? How the U.S. could be drawn in? Do you see this happening? Do you see signals on this? Do you think it's a busted flush? What's your thoughts on this?
Well, Iran is the superpower in West Asia. And if the Americans strike out at Iran, they'll be hit very hard. The Iranians have enormous drone capabilities. They have enormous missile capabilities. I think everyone now recognizes that. And those countries that host American bases in the region, they will be seen as hostile by Tehran. And Tehran will retaliate, and they'll destroy their infrastructure. So the countries in the Persian Gulf region will lose the ability to export oil and gas. What will that mean for the U.S. and global economy when gasoline prices are, I don't know, $20 a barrel, $20, $25, $30 a barrel? That would just bring down the U.S. economy. The United States, if they want, they can't even defeat Yemen. If they want to fight a war with Yemen, they'll have to invade the country, send in hundreds of thousands of forces. How much would that cost? How long would that last? And would it lead to victory? The same is true with the resistance in Iraq and Syria. This is not a war that the Americans can win. They've lost. Israel has lost, and now out of desperation, they want to sacrifice the Americans. But the Americans don't have a road to victory. It doesn't exist. So the right thing to do for the Americans is for them to find a negotiated deal, to learn to live with the people of this region. If the Americans really want to compete with China. And they probably won't be able to compete because they're wasting all their money on wars, whether it's in Ukraine or in West Asia. But if the United States really wants to compete with China, which is pulling ahead of the United States and is fighting no war, it's not wasting any money on war, then the United States has to build friendships. It has to decrease tensions with countries across the board. But so much blood has been spilled, that's not really possible anymore. With the Russians, they've killed, 30, 40, 50,000 Russians? The Russians will win the war in Ukraine.
And 400,000 Ukrainian soldiers have perished in the trenches.
Yes, yeah. Absolutely. But the point is that the Americans will need a better relationship with Russia. They've destroyed Ukraine. And the Ukraine also will have huge negative consequences more in the future for Europe. It already has, but it will get much worse because the country's been destroyed. But the Americans will need better relations with Russia. But now that all these Russian young men have been killed in war, is that really doable? The Americans have created hatred across West Asia and across the world because now the Palestinian issue is becoming a global issue. People across the globe are opposed to the United States. They see this as a Western genocide. So morality aside, the fact that the world sees the United States and its allies as immoral and inferior, morally speaking, the regime and the political establishment, all that aside, if the United States wants to compete with China, which is pulling ahead, this is exactly how it's not supposed to be done. This is exactly what's going to make China pull ahead more and more and leave the United States behind. These constant wars, these escalations, and the misery that the United States is imposing upon itself and everyone else.
And something happened 2 weeks ago that didn't get a lot of enough press coverage. I can understand why. And this has happened almost every single time. Iran has launched an intermediate range missile, first in the summer of 2017, Deir ez-Zor, if I'm not mistaken. They hit an ISIS or Al-Qaeda al-Nusra facility there. Everybody was quiet in the West. It did make Reuters. You saw it reported here. No big alarm bells. And then it happened again after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani and also Abu Mahdi Mohandes. Iran waited, and then they smashed a U.S. base in Iraq and also a facility in Erbil. Again, no response from the U.S. Then 2 weeks ago, Iran launched not one, not two, but 3 intermediate range missiles. And I did not see anybody talking about it. Very little, in fact, maybe a little bit about the Pakistani situation. But is this a case of Iran is articulating its own Monroe Doctrine for the region in the same way that the United States has its spheres of influence that it polices, but no response from the U.S. on this? Can they respond? Go ahead.
Well, 2 things here. One is that I think that the mentality in Tehran is very different from the United States. The Monroe Doctrine basically means that the Americas is the U.S. backyard. For Iran, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, these are Iranian allies. They're not proxies. In the West, they constantly say they're proxies. These are allies. And the Iranians support them, but they don't dictate terms to them. They make their own decisions. They have a strong ideological affinity. They're anti-colonial, they're anti-imperial, they are anti-Zionist, and they're anti-Western and American hegemony. They're opposed to Western and American hegemony. So they have strong similarities. Otherwise, the Syrian government is a secular government. Yemen is predominantly Zaidi. They have, they're different for their strong similarities culturally and religious-wise, but they're not proxies by any means. They're allies. And that's what makes it so strong, this relationship, this bond. Because if they were proxies, who has more money, Iran or the Americans? Iran or the Saudis? Iran or the United States and its client regimes and Europe combined, they have much more money than Iran does. But why did they fail? Because the United States fails to create real friendship. Everyone has to obey. That does not create strong bonds. But in the case of Iran and its allies, it's the opposite. So this is something that the Americans simply, they cannot defeat. The Iranians, by firing those missiles, they fired them over American bases towards ISIS camps in Idlib and those ISIS-affiliated camps. And those groups are supported by NATO. Their money, their funding, their weapons, where did they come from? They come from Turkey. Turkey is a part of NATO. This is an open secret. Just like the Americans who were killed today, the American soldiers who were killed today in Syria. What are they doing in Al-Tanf? That is where ISIS is. That is where ISIS stays, and then they launch attacks on the Syrian army from Al-Tanf. Why don't those ISIS troops ever attack American soldiers? Because they're working with American soldiers. They're no longer necessarily called ISIS, but they're the remnants of the ISIS or the Islamic State, as they call themselves. They are the remnant tribes of that. They're working with Americans in Al-Tanf. They're working in Idlib. They are in parts of Afghanistan. So the Iranians struck them both to send the American government a message in the way they struck them, because their missiles flew over American positions, but also they targeted them near the Mediterranean, saying to the Americans and to the Israelis that we can do the same in Tel Aviv. We can strike targets anywhere in Israel. So it is a message, but the problem with the Americans, and I don't mean the American people, you know that every time I say American, I mean the American political establishment. The problem is that they are too arrogant to accept that other countries are powerful and they can respond. But in this case, it's not even Iran anymore. The Americans are being they're being confronted by Yemen. They're being confronted by Iraq. They're being confronted by Syria. They're being confronted by Lebanon. But it's a front that's spread out across West Asia. And American allies in West Asia are gradually distancing themselves from the United States. They're like the rats that are quitting the ship, that are jumping ship. They know something's wrong. So you see how countries in West Asia are looking to improve ties with Russia, with China, with Iran, and looking to have a more balanced foreign policy. These were countries that in the past they put all their eggs in the American basket, these family dictatorships.
So rather than a Monroe Doctrine, as you said, is what you're describing here, this cooperation, which is, underpinned by the axis of resistance. By the way, when I talk to some of my American colleagues, they don't know what the axis of resistance is. And we've been talking about it for 5 or 6 years. That will show you how detached I think a lot of people in the Washington Beltway are from what's going on in the region, have been for quite some time. But are we actually seeing here, Dr. Marandi, is what the former foreign minister of Iran, Mohammad Zarif, he talked about, I remember it was a few years ago, is at the Munich Security Conference. He gave an incredible address. I think it was in 2018, if I'm not mistaken, around then. And he said what the region needs is a new security architecture built on mutual security. And a lot of people in the West were kind of scoffing at it at the time. Like, what's he talking about? But what he was talking about is what we're seeing happening now. what you've just described. Your thoughts on that?
Yes, I think that's been the arrogance of Europe and the United States that has roots in history. We've had 500 years of empire, or a series of empires, European empires, that have colonized Asia, Africa, the Americas. So for them to imagine a region where they're not in charge, where they don't have special privileges, where they don't call the shots, is very difficult, if not impossible, and unacceptable. They have special privileges. The Middle East is theirs. It's their realm of influence. Everywhere is their realm of influence. So for them, this sort of worldview is unacceptable, let alone its implementation. But the fact is that the world is changing. The West, in its corruption, has sent its businesses to China. It has sent manufacturing to China. The wealthy have sacrificed the working class for their own profits. The United States has been emptied out. Then the military-industrial complex has been waging perpetual war. They've been making trillions of dollars in profit, but ordinary Americans are the ones who are suffering. Again, they've sacrificed the American middle and working class as a result. And the constant attempts to dominate other countries is only making the United States increasingly isolated. The global South looks down upon brand America. Even in the past, when people disliked American foreign policy, there was an ambivalence because people like to go there to get jobs or to go to good university. But even that's changing, especially with what they've done in Gaza. People across the world are looking in shock. I never thought it would be like this. I never thought that the Americans would be so open in their support for genocide. And of course, there's Ukraine, which has helped to further empty or weaken Europe. Europe is worse than the United States. The situation there, the deindustrialization, Europe is now has reached. We're in winter in Europe, metaphorically speaking. Europe is on the decline. It's dying. Its industrialization, its industries are falling apart. Social tensions are on the rise. Extremist political parties are on the rise. It is not good at all in Europe. It's much worse than in the United States. So this sense of moral superiority, this false sense of moral superiority, this feeling of exceptionalism, of Eurocentrism, all of these make them look down at people across the world. But it's going to happen. Now, it can happen in a way which benefits the West, and that is if they try to be a part of this evolution, if they try to work with countries and different regions and to treat them as equals and to have a cooperating relationship. And it can be the exact opposite. The United States and Europe can behave like a drowning person who just lashes out at anything that gets near to it and bring it down with it. It may sound to some that I'm exaggerating, but I really think that the situation in the West is far worse than many people think. And I think that the years ahead are going to make today look like the good old days.
So the emergence of a new Middle East. So this would be in a multipolar world rather than a unipolar hegemonic order, which you've alluded to post the collapse of the Soviet Union. So a new Middle East that's emerging is going to be one of those poles in a multipolar world, is already working together as a major business partner with China, is becoming a political partner with China as well, is becoming a partner with Russia, is becoming a partner with South America, with South Africa. So this multipolar order is kind of already taking shape. I know this is just in the embryonic stage, as it were, but we're seeing a lot of things that are quite striking that we may never have been able to see previously. Just the fact that South Africa and Yemen have emerged as, kind of the heroes on the global stage. This is not insignificant. What are your thoughts on the emergence of a multipolar world?
You see people in London marching against the war, asking the Yemeni armed forces to take action. That's huge. We're not talking about some capital in West Asia or North Africa. We're talking about the heart of the British Empire. The world is changing. And again, as I said, it could be very messy. It could be bad for everyone. If the Americans and the Europeans played it smart, it could change to their benefit. I don't see it happening that way. I'm very pessimistic about the United States as things stand. I don't believe either party are willing to change. I don't believe any of the candidates or behind the scenes candidates or the potential future candidates. I don't see anyone in the United States, at least those from among the two parties, being really any different in this regard. So I think the years ahead are going to be difficult, but it's inevitable. All empires decline. And one reason why they decline so fast in many cases is because they don't recognize that they're declining. They're living in the past. They still live in that bubble. The British Empire, after the Second World War, the government, one of the recurring debates in the cabinet was, how do we preserve our image as an empire? And ultimately, when they tried to project power in the Suez, that was the moment when things fell apart, when everyone saw that the emperor had no clothes and they had to back down. So right now, the United States is behaving just like the British in the past. What do we do to show that we're king of the hill? What do we do to show that we're all powerful? What do we do to? But the problem is that you're not all powerful. You're not the superpower anymore. You have to rethink your relationships, but they can't do that. They think, no, how do we put everyone in their place? Okay, so now you want to put Yemen. You lob hundreds of missiles at Yemen. What happens? Nothing. They did no damage to the Yemeni armed forces because everything that the Yemeni armed forces have are underground. They're in tunnels. Just like in Gaza, just much more extensive tunnels and much more advanced technology because they're a much larger country. They have more access to the sea. So all of their missiles, their drones, their mobile radar systems, they bring them out, carry out an operation within a few minutes, and they go back into one of the tunnels. And the Americans can't do anything about it. The British, they're a joke. They're just there so that the Americans won't be alone. So they spend hundreds of millions of dollars firing missiles at nothing. Then Yemen hits a couple of ships. The whole global economy is impacted. What does the United States learn from this? They learn absolutely nothing. That's the problem. If they would learn from morality aside, the fact that the Americans are striking Yemen, which the Americans with the Saudis and the Emiratis and the Europeans and the Canadians impose a starvation siege there for almost 10 years. Just like in Gaza, what we have in Gaza today, the Americans and the Saudis and the Emiratis imposed on Yemen just over the last decade, killing hundreds of thousands of people, bombing the nation day and night, helping the Saudis, sending thousands of there were thousands of British advisors alone just keeping the Saudi Air Force operational. So the immorality of all of this aside, if the Americans were smart, they would change course, but they can't. They have learned nothing from Yemen. I assure you, they will learn nothing of what happened in Syria today. They will learn nothing of what happens in Iraq tomorrow. And they're not learning anything from this horrific genocide in Gaza and the cost that it has for the United States. I don't think many people in the United States recognize the damage that's being caused to the image of the United States across the world by Israel. Israel is sacrificing the United States and the collective West. They're dragging it down into the mud. No one in the world says the Israelis are doing this, that the Israelis are genocidal. They're saying the West and Israel are genocidal. No one is saying this is just Netanyahu. Or they say this is the Israeli people, but it's the collective West. Now, thanks to heroic people in the United States, heroic Jews, protesters on the streets in the United States, across Europe, people across the world are seeing that this is not the United States that's behind this. This is the political establishment. It's the political establishment in London and Paris and Berlin and elsewhere. But people across the world see that many young Jews have gone to the streets, or many young Jews are debunking the lies of the New York Times and the Washington Post and CNN and Fox News. So that is a very positive point here. Because just as people are seeing the genocide being carried out live, they're also seeing the resistance in the West. This resistance this resistance front in the region is not just this region. All of those people who are protesting, they're part of this resistance, this broader resistance. They're all in it together. So people see that, and I think that's a very positive sign, but I'm not naive enough to think that it's going to, at least for the time being, be strong enough to change course for Western governments.
Yeah, and throughout history, when you have alliances, when you have federations, you have countries, if they can coalesce around some basic values and basic agreements on certain things, this is how you form relations internationally. And one of those key principles was, but doesn't seem to be any longer, that mass killing is wrong, genocide is wrong. And this seems to be, it's been roundly rejected by the United States, literally, verbally, by Canada, by Germany, by the European Union, by the UK. So the rest of the world is moving in a completely different direction. And that group of nations, you could say the G7 plus Israel, if you want to abbreviate it, plus Australia, of course, the Five Eyes. So the world is moving forward. The people of the world, I think, even the people of the United States, on the whole, on the street, they understand the issue. But our governments, this elite sort of technocracy, doing their own thing, basically. This is a huge disconnect. And the price that is going to be paid, because maybe you can comment on this. I have one more question to ask you about Gaza and Palestine before we finish, but the U.S. is not willing to pay any price on the military battlefield. Not one soldier, not one aircraft, not one ship. They'll do anything because the price they'll pay at home for that, Joe Biden, Trump, whoever's president, because once that happens and you see the plane go down, you see the ship go down, you see the soldiers come back in the body bags, immediately the American people will react. Why are we there? What are we doing? But those questions aren't asked until that price is paid. Then the question is asked. But I don't see the political will they can't convince the public to make those sacrifices, to pay even that minimal price, but they're getting other people to pay the price for them. So there is a price to pay. So is it a case that the rest of the world is willing to pay those prices to defend their values, but America is no longer willing to pay any price to defend what it calls, I guess, the rules-based international order? I think there's a clock ticking on this. Go ahead.
I think these powers are miscalculating because ultimately they're going to lose control. Even if they're not sacrificing themselves and they're living in their mansions and they're making their billions through perpetual warfare, their stock, the value of their shares in the stock market is going up and their assets are increasing. Ultimately, this is going to the system is going to come crashing down. In the past, the United States was really the most powerful and wealthy country in the world. And I guess it's debatable, but perhaps the 1960s was the height of American wealth and power. In Vietnam, the United States ultimately had to pull out because there were so many body bags and so many Americans were dying. And as more and more Americans died, political awareness among the youth in particular increased. And so it was the death of Americans that really brought about change in U.S. foreign policy. Now, I think it's more complicated because American soldiers don't represent American society. And increasingly, they come from the disenfranchised class. They don't have, their families don't have a voice. So if they're sacrificed, if they die, it really doesn't have much of an impact. There are American casualties just today in Syria, but no one really will care. The Americans will lash out and escalate, and many people won't recognize this. But what the United States is doing is that they're emptying out the middle class. They're destroying the United States. And of course, as people are flowing in from the southern border and wages are going down and people are losing their jobs and all they see is war after war abroad, I think ultimately this is not sustainable. I don't believe that this can continue. Now, how will it end? I don't know. I don't know how it will end or how it will evolve, to be more precise. But the Americans are going to have to leave. And when they leave, they're going to leave in a way in which it will take decades for them to be able to rebuild relationships. So no matter what the American government does, whether they escalate or not, I don't see a future for the West. But if they escalate, I think it's going to get much worse. If the Americans decide that they're going to start striking at Yemen and Syria and Iraq and pushing for greater conflict in Lebanon, I think at the end of the day, they're going to lose. But then the coming generations across the region, they're going to hate the West. And does that help the West in its rivalry with China, with other powers? Of course not. So it doesn't look good. But in any case, there are the protests in the United States and Europe, the young Jewish anti-war activists, their work has not gone unnoticed across the world. And these are signs of hope.
I agree. I share your optimism there. I've been surprised at how what they call the Gen Z or young generation, how they've just taken hold of this issue, recognize it straight away, and getting behind it, and it's really encouraging. The last thing I want to ask you before we go, and appreciate your time, Dr. Marandi, is there's a lot of misconceptions in the West, especially in the U.S., in Britain, in Canada too, but misconceptions about what is Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran, what is their interest in Palestine or in Gaza, but just say Palestine. The misconception is that Iran's only interest is to back Hamas and back its proxies in order to throw Israel into the Mediterranean Sea. That's the long and the short of it. I think this is a misconception, but I want to hear what your understanding is, how you view what Iran's interest and position is regarding Palestine, where it comes from, and also does Iran what is the conversation within Iran about a one state or a two state solution? If you can clear up some of these misconceptions, because I think it's a good opportunity for our Western audience.
Sure. If one looks into history, before the revolution, the revolutionaries who were either in jail or in hiding or exiled, there in their writings, you could see that there were two key foreign policy issues that were in the global South that were very important for them. One was liberation in South Africa, the defeat of apartheid South Africa, and the second was the Palestinian cause. In fact, the Iranian leader, or the leader of the revolution, Ayatollah Khamenei, when he was president during the 1980s, he traveled to all the frontline states in Southern Africa. And Iran financially supported the ANC and other resistance organizations and their military wing. And Iran broke off ties with apartheid South Africa. So Iran, it pursued the same policy towards South Africa as it pursues in Palestine today. And the results that came out of the struggle of the people of South Africa were acceptable to Iran. Right now in South Africa, you have white South Africans living, going to university, having businesses, doing agriculture, and Black South Africans are equal citizens according to the law. Iran's position on Palestine, the whole of Palestine, not the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, the whole of Palestine is that apartheid must be set aside, and that all the people of the land must be treated equally, and the Palestinians who've been expelled have a right of return. But Iran does not want anything bad to happen to ordinary Jews, that they want everyone to be able to live side by side. Something that I think probably many of your listeners probably know, but many Americans don't know, is that Iran has synagogues. We have kosher restaurants in Tehran. We have a Jewish MP. According to the Constitution, we have to have a Jewish MP, even though the Jewish population in Iran is not very large, but one seat in parliament is set aside for them. A number of seats are set aside for Christians and Zoroastrians, but one is set aside for the Jewish community. At least a Jew can be 10 Jews, 20 Jews can be elected to parliament, but one Jew has to be in parliament. So I'm sure the narrative in the West on Iran is quite different, but that's more or less how it is.
So one state, everybody with equal rights, treated equally under the law, like a normal country, like most countries in the world. not segregated by ethnicity or religion, not separately treated, more or less. So these are values that the West believes that it's constantly exporting, right? Is the vindication that they have made at the American dream, the Constitution. But when it comes to Israel and Palestine, they withhold that for this special dispensation for this case, which I think is one of the main problems. That's not quite, Americans aren't quite, it's not the first thing that comes to mind when they're looking at the situation in the Middle East. But that's what you're basically, your country is calling for, isn't it?
That's right. That's Iranian policy. Iran believes that there must be a vote, a referendum, where all Palestinians, all people who belong to the land, whether those exiled, whether they're Christians or Jews or Muslims, they get a say into what form of government would exist in future, but it must be a government that would be all-inclusive. And it would probably not be all that bad it would probably be a good thing for most Jews who actually reside in Palestine. But when you're trained to hate, when you're trained to be racist, and when your allies spoil you and they close their eyes to your racism, Israel is like a spoiled brat. I mean, I gave this example a while back, and I'm sure some Americans would be offended, but the United States and the West is like Saddam Hussein. The regime in Washington, the political establishment, they're like Saddam Hussein, evil, nasty, ruthless, and murderous, but sane. Israel is like Odeh, the son of Saddam Hussein. The same characteristics, but also a spoiled brat, a playboy, who no one could ever say no to, and so he thought he could do anything. So now the Israelis, they think they can do anything. They can speak openly about genocide. Who does that? Saddam Hussein never spoke openly about genocide. None of the monsters of the 20th century that we've read about in history openly spoke about carrying genocide, or at least it's not so well documented. As the Israelis, the president speaks about it. That's what made it so easy for the South African legal team. They just had to gather all the quotes and the sources, and anyone who read that text, they would be stunned. They would be stunned as, about the degree of genocidal intent that exists across Israeli society. So this is to a large degree because the West allowed this to happen. They knew they were racist. They knew they were exceptionalists. They knew they were supremacists. Their ambassadors in Tel Aviv know this. Their journalists know this, but they all closed their eyes. It's been happening for decades. Every day in the West, it's been happening in the West Bank, in Gaza. It's been going on for forever. They know this, but they close their eyes, and it only makes the Israeli regime worse, and it makes those Israelis who have these ethno-supremacist views even worse. So they pass on these qualities to the next generation, and each generation it gets worse till we reach a point where all the leaders speak openly about genocide, ethnic cleansing, and they speak about Palestinians as animals.
And that's that, and the world has witnessed this,
and the world is watching live
in real time.
And then the world is seeing this in real time, and then in real time they're seeing Western officials saying, "No, Israel, we shouldn't have a ceasefire." As children are being massacred, as people are being forced to eat animal feed, and so on.
No, it is a stark, very shocking revelation for this generation. And I think these images and the things that you're saying right there Muhammad, are going to be emblazoned on a lot of people's minds for many years to come. And one hopes, we all hope, we share the hope that this will lead to a greater awareness and positive change throughout the world eventually. But as you said, it's not going to be an easy one. Certainly not. No one's expecting it to be easy. But I do hold out hope for the future. You have to. Otherwise,
that's right.
Otherwise, why carry on? But we do, and we're very grateful that you're able to join us for this conversation. I really appreciate it, and all the best for you and all your friends, family, and countrymen in Iran. We hope to speak to you again very soon, Dr. Mohammad Marandi.
Thank you very much. The same to you and your friends and family, and to all of your listeners and viewers.
There he goes, ladies and gentlemen. That is Dr. Mohammad Marandi. We've linked to his Twitter account. This is one of the accounts that you need to be following if you're on social media. Just go there, give him a follow his work. We will be hopefully releasing some of the recordings of this during the week as we get the clips processed. But thank you guys for joining us. Stay with us, however, on the Alternate Current Radio Network and at 21st Century Wire. And on the other side, we'll come back with our final segment of Overdrive with Hesher, Brian McLean from State of the Nation, and Basil Valentine, our intrepid correspondent. All this and more coming up. Stay with us. We'll see you in a few.